Cameron from IPD here to talk to you about some basics of tune-ups and how things work. This isn't going to be a fully integrated guide of every single step, but just kind of a basic thing to help you as the DIY person do your tune-up in your driveway a little more confidently. Today we're going to talk about a couple different cars. 240 here on this side, S70 on this side, both of which are very different cars, different chassis, different motors, but the basics of the tune-up and how those things work together are all the same. So let's jump right into it. So starting with the 240 model, we'll talk about the real basics here first. So when we talk about a tune-up, the main things you usually do are going to be spark plugs, distributor cap, ignition rotor, and sometimes spark plug wires as well. Now we're not going to talk about spark plugs too in depth about how to install them and stuff like that. We'll just kind of show you the main pieces, locations where they are. So first up, let's talk about a cap and a rotor and what they are and what they do. The job of these is to take the spark and take it through here into each individual port, into the spark plug wire, into the actual spark plug to make it fire. Now how does that happen? How do these work together? It's actually very simple. It's just a little drive on the distributor that spins the rotor around based on the auxiliary shaft in the motor, and that just has a toothed gear on there that spins them together. And that means this sits in there, pops on the rotor, sits inside the cap, and just spins inside here. And if you look at the cap or the rotor and look at the pieces here, you can see the contact on the outside here, and when it spins around it hits these little contacts on the inside of the distributor cap. And energy has gone into the middle of it through here from the ignition coil, and that connects to this little spot on the rotor. So really it's just a matter of this thing spinning in there, and as it goes by these contacts, sending a spark through the spark plug wire. Now common times you'll hear, or a lot of times you'll hear people talk about the number 1 cylinder, the number 2 cylinder, number 3 cylinder, and firing order. And what that means is just the physical locations. You're always going to have number 1 at the front of the motor. So in 240 models and 740 and any of the Volvos that are rear wheel drive, that's always going to be at the front of the car. So you got number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now talking about firing order, that just means at what rate and in what order does the ignition system fire the ignition signal through there, into here, and then out of here into which cylinder at which time. So it's a little confusing. You can look in your service manual for what the order is. As far as the theory behind why they fire in that order, that's not something we're going to cover here. It's a little more advanced, but it doesn't really matter for what we're talking about. So one important note on this when you're replacing these is make sure that you do note that firing order if you're going to pull all the spark plug wires off, so you know in what order to put them back on. Now if you're not sure about that and you just want to be a little more careful, just simply do one at a time. You can pull the cap off, put the new cap on, and then just replace the wires one at a time on here. Or same thing if you're going to run new ignition wires, just replace those one at a time and it won't be any big worry. The last thing I want to talk about on this car real quick is just going to be about these spark plug wires and the ends of them. Now if you look at these, they've got this little metal boot on them. Some of them are going to have a rubber boot, but the idea is the same. It's just there to insulate it. On the inside, where it interfaces with the spark plug, there's a couple different styles, and the spark plugs come a couple different ways. Now most spark plugs like NGKs are going to have a removable end, so it can work with either style plug. And when I say that, I mean at the end of the spark plug there's either a nubbed end or a threaded end, and your wires are going to correspond with that. For more questions about that and which ones work together, see our website or give us a call. Now moving on to one of the newer model cars like this, which is a 1998 S70 on the P80 chassis as it's called. Even though it's much different like I discussed, it's still a lot of the same pieces. Now something to consider, we talked about firing order in the other car, same thing applies here in what number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 cylinder is. The part that gets more interesting on these though, if you want to look down this way, is since these engines are what's called transversely mounted for the front wheel drive orientation, the motor actually sits kind of sideways. So that means that the front of the motor is the timing belt side, which is in the passenger side on this model. So in this car, number 1 cylinder is here, 2, 3, 4, 5. So think about it that way. Just think about the motor being turned 90 degrees that way. Beyond that though, the basics are the same. It is a few different pieces that are kind of undercover on this, so you have to remove that top cover, and sometimes you have to remove your upper engine pipe depending on what's on there to get to your spark plugs and to get to your wires and stuff. And if you look down here, you'll see that the same pieces exist on this. You have the distributor cap here, you have the ignition rotor underneath it, and you have the spark plug wires coming off of it. On this one, it actually ends up being a little bit easier than on the 240 models because everything is labeled and keyed on the distributor cap. It has bolts that screw it on instead of clips that makes it a little easier, and same goes for the ignition rotor. It screws on, so it really just goes on kind of one way. And if you look closer here too, and this is where knowing the firing order and knowing the position of each cylinder comes in handy. Each one of these terminals is labeled with which number cylinder it goes to. Further making it a little easier, when you get into these cars, the spark plug wire sets come from Volvo and from Bugicor, the OEM manufacturer, pre-loomed together. Everything's real close together, makes it really darn easy to get everything in the right spot because it kind of only lays out one way because of the lengths that they are. Still, if you're nervous or you're unsure, don't forget to label them if you want to. But on these cars, they made it a little more foolproof. So that's about it for the basic tune-up on these cars. While it's not a very difficult task, it can be a little intimidating if you don't have the right knowledge. So this should help you get the basic idea of what's involved and what your next steps might be for you being the DIY guy doing this in your driveway or your garage. Now, like always, it's very important when you're doing a repair or any kind of service work to have a good service manual to refer to. Things like firing order are going to be in there. Things like procedure, if you forget or have questions or anything, will be in there, so it's very important. If you have any questions on service manual, which one's right for your car, or if you have questions on applications, prices, parts, of all the pieces involved in these tune-ups, you can always call us or visit our website at www.ipdusa.com.